Shaquille O'Neal strode into an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the city, his towering frame hard to miss even amidst the glittering chandeliers and elegant decor. His attire was casual, a simple gray t-shirt, loose-fitting sweatpants, and a pair of well-worn sneakers, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer gowns that adorned the other diners. He carried himself with ease, his expression calm and unbothered, as he surveyed the bustling space before choosing a discreet corner table, hoping to enjoy his meal in peace. However, before he could even glance at the menu, a waitress approached him with a look of disdain. Her uniform was pristine, her hair neatly tucked into a bun without a single strand out of place. She wore an air of superiority, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed contempt as she took in Shaq's appearance. With a sneer, she tilted her head and remarked, loud enough for surrounding patrons to hear, "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" A hush fell over the nearby tables. Conversations dwindled as curious eyes turned toward the exchange, watching how the moment would unfold. The words hung in the air, sharp and laced with insinuation. It was clear she had already made a judgment about him based solely on his appearance, assuming he didn't belong in such a luxurious establishment. But Shaq, a man accustomed to scrutiny both on and off the court, didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze with unwavering composure, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had faced tougher opponents in his life, a judgmental waitress was nothing new. He leaned back slightly, his deep voice calm yet firm. "Yes, I believe I can manage," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of quiet confidence. The waitress, Emma, was taken aback for a brief moment but quickly regained her composure. She smirked, determined to make him uncomfortable. "Very well," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me see if we have a table available for someone like you." She turned on her heel and sauntered toward the seating chart, deliberately taking her time. She wanted to make him wait, to make him feel unwelcome. Shaq, however, remained unbothered. He clasped his hands together and observed the restaurant, taking in the ornate chandeliers, the polished marble floors, and the elegantly plated dishes being served at other tables. After what seemed like an unnecessarily long delay, Emma returned with an exaggerated smile. "Follow me," she said, her tone falsely sweet. She led him past the prime spots of the restaurant, where diners clinked the crystal glasses and engaged in refined conversation. Instead, she continued walking, guiding him toward the farthest, least desirable corner of the establishment, near the kitchen doors where the clatter of dishes and the occasional burst of kitchen chatter filled the air. The lighting was dimmer here, the ambience nowhere near as refined as the main dining area. Stopping at the table, she gestured theatrically. "This should suit you perfectly," she said, dropping the menu onto the table with an audible thud. Shaq remained composed, his expression unreadable. He pulled out the chair and sat down, his posture relaxed, his demeanor unfazed. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying no trace of irritation or resentment. Emma, expecting him to lash out or storm off, was momentarily disappointed by his lack of reaction. Still, she wasn't finished. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her tone still laced with condescension. Shaq flipped open the menu, scanning it briefly before replying, "Water will be fine, thank you." Emma rolled her eyes before walking away, leaving him alone at the table. By now, a few nearby diners had caught on to what was happening. Some exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves. Others simply watched in silence, intrigued by how the evening was unfolding. Minutes later, Emma returned with a glass of water, setting it down with just a bit too much force. "Are you ready to order, or do you need more time?" she asked, her arms crossed. Shaq nodded, closing the menu. "I'll have the chef's special." Emma's brows lifted slightly. The chef's special was one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. She hesitated, as if giving him one last chance to back out. "Are you sure?" she asked. Shaq's smile widened ever so slightly. "Yes, I'm sure." Without another word, Emma scribbled down his order and turned away, still convinced that he was out of place, still waiting for the moment when he would realize he didn't belong. As Shaq sat in silence, enjoying the ambient sounds of the restaurant, the murmurs around him grew louder. The guests had recognized him now. The initial judgments some had made based on his attire were beginning to shift as whispers of his name floated through the air. That's Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend, the businessman, the philanthropist. Emma, however, remained oblivious. She was too caught up in her own assumptions, too focused on her perceived victory. She returned to the table, balancing a plate of the chef's special, and placed it before him. "Enjoy," she said, her voice still carrying that same mocking edge. Shaq picked up his fork and took a bite, savoring the meal with quiet appreciation. He had been to countless fine dining establishments before. He had experienced impeccable service, but he had also encountered situations like this, where appearances dictated treatment. This, however, was different. This was a moment he intended to turn on its head. As he finished his meal, he signaled for the bill. Emma smirked as she handed it over, expecting hesitation, expecting shock. Instead, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black credit card, effortlessly handing it to her. Her eyes widened as she glanced at the card, recognizing it as an elite-tier membership reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Silence stretched between them as she processed what had just happened. He wasn't just some casually dressed guest who had stumbled into the wrong place. He was someone who could probably buy the entire restaurant if he wanted to. Shaq signed the receipt, then reached for a pen and jotted something down beneath his signature. Emma, still in disbelief, hesitated before picking up the slip. Her breath caught in her throat. He had left a tip that exceeded her monthly salary. She looked up, her arrogance now replaced with sheer embarrassment. I didn't realize." Shaq stood up, his towering presence even more imposing than before. He looked at her, his expression kind but firm. "Maybe next time, don't judge a book by its cover," he said. With that, he turned and strode toward the exit, the entire restaurant watching in stunned silence. By the time the doors swung shut behind him, Emma was left standing there, the bill in her hands, her preconceived notions shattered. That night, a lesson had been learned, one that would linger far beyond the walls of that restaurant. And as for Shaq, he had done what he always did, let his presence speak louder than words. Shaq showed no trace of discomfort, not even a flicker of hesitation. His presence remained unshaken, steady as a rock against the gentle waves of subtle scorn. Instead of responding to the condescension directed at him, he simply lifted his gaze, his deep eyes carrying the faintest glimmer of amusement. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his voice calm and unhurried, as if he were ordering the simplest dish on the menu. His response was so nonchalant, so effortlessly composed, that Emma momentarily faltered. She had expected uncertainty, hesitation, perhaps even an awkward backtrack. Instead, she found herself momentarily disarmed by his unwavering demeanor. Recovering quickly, she let out a sharp laugh, one loud enough to turn the heads of several nearby diners. "Oh, really?" she replied, her tone dripping with saccharine sweetness, though anyone paying attention could hear the edge of mockery beneath it. "I do hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of dish that just anyone can understand." A hush fell over the nearby tables as whispers broke out among the guests. "Did she really just say that?" a woman muttered to her companion. "She's so rude. Why would she talk to a customer like that?" Another diner shook his head, disapproving. "She probably thinks he can't afford it." Emma, either oblivious or indifferent to the growing discomfort around her, remained poised at Shaq's table, her fingers resting on its edge as she awaited a reaction. But Shaq merely smiled. "Thank you for the suggestion," he said, his tone remaining polite, warm even. "I'm looking forward to trying it." His composed response unsettled Emma. In her mind, this tall man, dressed in casual sportswear and worn sneakers, could not possibly grasp the refinement of such a luxurious dish. And yet, as she stood there, she began to realize that it was not Shaq who looked out of place, it was her own behavior, her own thinly veiled disdain, that had begun to expose her pettiness to the entire restaurant. Turning away sharply, she made her way to the service counter, her voice deliberately raised so that others could hear her. "Filet mignon Rossini," she called out, then muttered just loudly enough for a nearby colleague, Jake, to hear. "He probably doesn't even know what he's ordering. People like that pick expensive dishes just to look fancy. But wait till the check comes. I bet he'll be out the door before he even touches it." Jake, a young man with a kind face, looked uneasy. He cast a glance toward Shaq, who remained seated in the corner, his posture relaxed, his expression one of quiet amusement. "Maybe he's just here to enjoy the experience," Emma, Jake murmured. "Who knows? He might have his own reasons for coming here." Emma scoffed. "Reasons? Look at his outfit. Who comes to this restaurant in worn-out shoes unless they're pretending to be something they're not?" Jake averted his gaze, unwilling to argue. He knew that confronting Emma would do little good. Instead, he continued with his work, glancing over at Shaq every now and then, curiosity gnawing at him. Meanwhile, Shaq sat at his table, undisturbed by the murmurs around him. He leisurely flipped through the menu, appearing completely unbothered by the judgmental stares. His demeanor remained unchanged, his calmness unwavering. He was here for a reason, and it had nothing to do with impressing anyone. At a nearby table, an older couple observed the scene. Mr. Carter, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair, took a sip from his wine glass, his gaze never leaving Shaq. "There's something special about that man," he murmured to his wife. Mrs. Carter, equally intrigued, leaned closer. "It's strange how they're treating him. Who do you think he is?" "Someone who understands patience," Mr. Carter said thoughtfully. "That level of calmness, it's not something everyone has." Across the restaurant, Emma's voice carried once more. "See, he didn't even have a reservation. People like him just walk in to see if they can blend in. But I guarantee, when that bill comes, he'll bolt." Her words, once whispered, were now loud enough for several diners to hear. Disapproving glances were cast her way, subtle but noticeable. Among those listening was Lisa, a young businesswoman dining with a friend. She frowned, shaking her head slightly. "She's being unbelievably rude," Lisa whispered. "That man hasn't done anything to deserve this." Her companion, a composed young man, nodded. "It seems like his very existence annoys her." The atmosphere of the restaurant was beginning to shift. The air, once filled with the gentle hum of conversation, now held an undercurrent of tension. Emma's voice, Shaq's quiet composure, the murmurs of the guests, it was all converging into something unspoken but powerful. And yet, Shaq remained the same. Unbothered, unrushed, undisturbed. He continued flipping through the menu as if savoring every moment of his culinary adventure, unaffected by the weight of judgment pressing against him. He had seen this before, many times, in many places. He understood people like Emma, those who judged based on appearances, who mistook quiet confidence for weakness. But he had no intention of proving anything to her. He had nothing to prove. At the Carter's table, Mr. Carter sighed, setting his glass down. "The world is a strange place," he mused. "People forget that a person's worth isn't determined by their clothes." Mrs. Carter nodded in agreement, watching as Emma continued to talk, completely unaware of the effect she was having on the restaurant's atmosphere. What she failed to realize was that she was not in control of this situation, Shaq was. His mere presence had shifted the energy of the entire room. Emma, still reveling in her misplaced confidence, decided to take things a step further. If Shaq wouldn't react, then she would push harder. She returned to his table, her smirk firmly in place. "Enjoying the ambience?" she asked, her voice coated in false politeness. "I hope you're ready for the check when it comes. We wouldn't want any awkward situations." Shaq simply looked at her, his expression unchanging. "I appreciate your concern," he said smoothly. "But I assure you, there won't be any awkward situations." Emma's smirk faltered, just slightly. She had been waiting for embarrassment, for stammering, for some sign that her words had landed. Instead, she found herself met with the same unshakable presence. And then, the moment came. The waiter approached, placing the bill gently on the table. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black card, one that only a select few would recognize. As he handed it over, a hush fell over the restaurant. Emma's eyes widened slightly, recognition dawning on her too late. The murmurs around them ceased as understanding spread through the room. Shaq was no ordinary diner, and Emma had just made a very, very big mistake. A quiet sense of curiosity lingered in the air as a small jazz band played in the far corner of the restaurant, the gentle melodies weaving a soothing ambience through the dimly lit space. The soft hum of conversation mingled with the delicate strum of the bass and the occasional clink of silverware against fine china. As the final note of the song faded, a single, warm applause echoed through the room. Shah sat at his table, his hands coming together in a calm, appreciative clap. His applause was neither rushed nor exaggerated, just a steady rhythm of appreciation that resonated with sincerity. The band members exchanged pleased glances, their expressions lighting up with gratitude. Around the room, a few patrons turned their heads, drawn by the unexpected yet graceful display. The attention Shah garnered wasn't just from the band. Other diners, initially caught in their own conversations, began to take notice. Some whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued. "How does he stay so calm?" One murmured. "He's been waiting for ages, yet he doesn't even look frustrated," another observed. At the counter, Emma's smile, the one she so effortlessly wore for other guests, was long gone. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she darted glances in Shah's direction. The man's unwavering patience was unnerving. It wasn't just his composure, it was the way he seemed almost above it all, as if he saw something others couldn't. Her fingers curled into a fist, but she quickly forced them to relax. Why wasn't he reacting? No complaints, no demands for service, just silent waiting. She bit her lower lip in frustration. Was he doing this on purpose? Determined to push him further, she turned her attention to a newly arrived table, where a group of diners sat scanning the menu. With an exaggeratedly cheerful tone, she launched into an extensive explanation of the dishes, her voice carrying just enough to ensure that Shah could hear her. The delay, she knew, would only extend his wait. Across the room, Mr. and Mrs. Carter exchanged glances. They had been watching the unfolding situation with growing discomfort. Mrs. Carter leaned in slightly, her voice hushed. "She's making him wait on purpose. It's been at least 20 minutes. Mr. Carter swirled his wine in his glass, his gaze locked on Emma. "I see it, but what interests me more is that he doesn't seem to mind." He took a measured sip, then continued. "He's waiting for something else." Shah remained seated, his posture relaxed. His eyes drifted over the room, occasionally pausing on a painting or the chandelier above, as if the entire setting were nothing more than a fleeting moment to be observed rather than endured. Emma's frustration only grew. Each time she passed his table, she deliberately turned her back, her voice rising just enough for those nearby to hear. "Some people just don't belong here," she mused to a fellow server, her words laced with mock amusement. "It's funny watching them try so hard to fit in." She didn't address Shah directly, but the target was clear. A ripple of unease spread through the restaurant. A few diners exchanged uneasy glances, others whispered in hushed tones. At another table, Lisa, a young woman with a sharp eye for injustice, set her wine glass down a little too hard. She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "She's awful," she muttered to her companion, a man who had also been watching the situation unfold. Her friend, more contemplative, nodded slowly. "But look at him. He doesn't need anyone to defend him. He knows exactly what he's doing." What had begun as an ordinary dinner service had now turned into an unspoken battle of patience and professionalism. The longer Shah remained unaffected, the more Emma's immaturity was exposed. Yet she seemed oblivious, caught in a game she had already lost. The tension in the restaurant was no longer about the food, the music, or the service. It was about the quiet defiance of a single man and the unraveling of a server who thought she held the upper hand. Mrs. Carter exhaled sharply. "This is unacceptable." Her husband nodded. "We need to speak to the manager." In the corner, Lisa continued observing Shah, her curiosity deepening. "He's playing the long game," she mused. Her companion raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe he doesn't see it as a game at all." Nearby, an elderly woman, Mrs. Hamilton, sipped her tea and set the cup down with a soft clink. She turned to her granddaughter, her voice calm yet firm. "This is disgraceful. Servers are here to serve, not to judge." The younger woman, watching the scene unfold, leaned in. "Do you think he'll do anything? He's just sitting there." Mrs. Hamilton smiled knowingly. "His silence is an answer in itself. People who know their worth don't need to prove it. That girl will bring herself down soon enough." Emma, unaware of the storm of discontent brewing around her, continued her charade. She lingered at tables, chatting animatedly, making sure to project an air of false cheer. As she walked past Shah's table yet again, she spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "We need higher standards. Some people just don't understand the level of sophistication required here." Shah finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The faintest of smiles flickered at the corners of his lips before he turned his attention back to the room. Murmurs spread among the guests. Mr. Carter, his patience finally at an end, placed his napkin on the table. "That's enough. I'm speaking to the manager." His wife nodded in agreement. "I hope Shah doesn't leave before this is settled. He deserves better than this." The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. What had once been a pleasant evening filled with music and fine dining had transformed into a silent reckoning. And as the minutes ticked by, it became clear, Emma's game was over, and the consequences were about to unfold. The air carried an undeniable chill, though it wasn't the temperature that made it so. Emma's smile was laced with ice, her words sharp and pointed. "This is what you ordered. I hope you can appreciate it," she said, her voice carrying an almost imperceptible edge. She stood there, her posture rigid, waiting for a reaction. Shaq, as always, remained composed, his demeanor unwaveringly polite. His gaze shifted downward, taking in the meticulously arranged dish before him. After a brief pause, he lifted his eyes to meet hers, offering a warm and courteous nod. "It looks delicious." "Thank you," he said, his tone exuding sincerity, completely ignoring the challenge embedded in her statement. Emma wasn't one to let things end so easily. She leaned in slightly, her stance hovering between friendliness and intimidation. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but the underlying sharpness made her words crystal clear. "This dish is for connoisseurs. I'm guessing it's your first time." There was a subtle bitterness to her words, as though she anticipated his discomfort. Shaq met her gaze without hesitation. His dark eyes were steady, devoid of irritation or offense. Instead, he offered a small, measured smile and nodded. "Thank you for the advice," he replied with practiced ease. The effortless grace of his response unsettled not only Emma but also the onlookers who had been quietly observing the exchange. Instead of humbling him, Emma's attempt at sarcasm had backfired, exposing her own pettiness. Lisa, sitting at a nearby table, couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned toward her companion, her voice brimming with indignation. He just politely thanked her, and she's still being sarcastic. Unbelievable. Her friend nodded, eyes locked on Shaq's table. She's trying to provoke him, but she definitely picked the wrong target. At the center of the restaurant, Mr. and Mrs. Carter watched the interaction with knowing expressions. Mr. Carter lifted his wine glass but didn't drink, his keen eyes following Emma's every movement. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he murmured, his voice barely audible. A man like that doesn't need to argue. She'll end up embarrassing herself. Emma, oblivious to the judgmental glances from other diners, straightened. Her gaze scanned Shaq's face, searching for the slightest flicker of unease or irritation. But there was nothing, no sign of discomfort, no annoyance, only that same calm, unwavering demeanor. A flicker of unease crossed her mind, but she quickly masked it with another smug remark. If this doesn't suit your taste, we always have simpler options. Feel free to order something else if needed. Shaq's smile didn't waver. He nodded lightly. Thank you, I'll consider it. His composure was almost infuriating. Emma clenched the small notebook in her hand tightly, her nails pressing into the leather. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high, but her mind was racing. At the counter, she slammed the silver tray down, causing her colleague, Jake, to flinch. He's just pretending to be polite, she hissed under her breath, frustration dripping from every syllable. I bet he doesn't even know what he just ordered. People like that come here for attention. Jake regarded her with a mixture of disapproval and quiet amusement. Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner. Isn't it our job to serve everyone? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Emma spun to face him, her eyes flashing. Can't you see, Jake? He doesn't belong here. I bet he'll leave as soon as he sees the bill. Meanwhile, Shaq took his time savoring the dish before him. The filet mignon Rossini was an exquisite masterpiece, the tender beef perfectly complemented by the rich foie gras and decadent truffle sauce. Each bite was a harmonious blend of flavors, a testament to the chef's skill. The restaurant's murmurs grew louder. A few diners whispered in hushed tones, some expressing quiet indignation on his behalf, others shooting disapproving glances at Emma. Though no one spoke outright, the atmosphere had shifted from refined elegance to uneasy tension. Seated in the most inconspicuous corner of the restaurant, Shaq had inadvertently become the center of attention. Yet, he remained undisturbed, continuing his meal with an air of quiet authority, as if he were the one in control of the entire room. Emma had no idea that her actions were about to lead her into an unforgettable lesson. She had barely returned to the counter when a sudden hush fell over the restaurant. From the reception desk, the manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged. A middle-aged man with a reputation for perfection, he walked briskly toward Shaq's table, his expression marked by concern. The sudden shift in attention made the other diners glance toward the far corner with curiosity. When Mr. Thompson reached the table, he gave a slight bow, his voice brimming with respect. Shaq, it's such an honor to have you here. I sincerely apologize for the delay. We had no idea you'd be joining us tonight. His words struck the restaurant like a thunderclap. Conversations halted, forks paused mid-air, and the soft clinking of glasses ceased entirely. Silence spread through the room like a ripple, eyes widening in disbelief. Shaq, as unruffled as ever, placed his knife and fork down gently before looking up at Mr. Thompson. It's no problem. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner. Across the room, Emma froze, the tray still in her hands. Her eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before her, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Shaq, did he just call him Shaq? Her heart pounded as realization dawned. A young couple nearby whispered just loudly enough for her to hear. That's Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend. He owns stakes in so many businesses, another added. And he's a huge philanthropist. How did they not recognize him? The whispers spread like wildfire. Faces that had once held idle curiosity now brimmed with admiration and astonishment. A few diners cast knowing glances toward Emma, their expressions tinged with silent judgment. Her breathing became shallow. Shame clawed at her chest. Her hands trembled, gripping the tray as though it could somehow anchor her against the storm of realization crashing over her. Mr. Thompson turned then, his sharp gaze flickering toward Emma. The message was clear. Shaq, still seated, picked up his glass of water and looked at her directly. His gaze wasn't harsh, but it held an unmistakable weight, as though he saw straight through her. Emma wished, in that moment, that she could vanish entirely. She had made a terrible mistake, and there was no undoing it. Emma had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to maintain composure under pressure. But tonight, she felt that slipping away, unraveling in front of a full restaurant. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The room felt suffocating, the murmurs of the patrons growing louder in her ears as she stood frozen, unable to turn back time or erase what had just happened. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray she held, knuckles whitening as she struggled to maintain her posture. Across the room, Shaq set his glass of water down, his movements deliberate and composed. He wasn't angry, not outwardly, but his presence commanded attention. When he leaned forward, fixing Emma with an unreadable gaze, she felt as though she was being stripped bare, every flaw, every misstep illuminated under the weight of his stare. His voice, deep and steady, carried through the air like a force of nature. "Miss Emma, what do you believe is the most important aspect of customer service?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Her mind scrambled for an answer, but all she could think about was the mistake she had just made. She tried to swallow down the rising panic, tried to form a coherent sentence, but all she could manage was, I didn't know who you were." Shaq shook his head, disappointment evident but tempered with an unshakable resolve. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect. Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same dignity." His words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, absorbing the whispers, silencing the clinking of silverware. The air itself seemed to still, waiting for what would happen next. Some patrons exchanged glances, others nodded in quiet agreement. But the lesson wasn't just for Emma, it was for everyone who had been present in that moment, watching, judging, and silently accepting what had unfolded. Emma felt the heat rising to her cheeks, the shame crawling up her spine. But, she tried, her voice barely above a whisper, "You're different from other customers." Shaq leaned back slightly, his expression unwavering. "And that is exactly the problem," he said. "Respect is not something you ration out based on appearances or assumptions. It's a fundamental right that every person deserves, regardless of what they wear, how they speak, or where they come from." Emma lowered her head, gripping the tray even tighter. She had no defense. Every moment of the evening replayed in her mind like a slow-moving nightmare. Every word she had spoken, every judgment she had made, now felt like weights around her neck, pulling her deeper into a pit of regret. From the central table, Mr. Carter gave a subtle nod, whispering to his wife, he didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't have to make a scene. And yet, he's just taught her a lesson she won't forget. Lisa, seated nearby, lifted her wine glass but didn't drink. She watched Emma, her own disappointment clear. "I hope she truly learns from this," she murmured. Mr. Thompson, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, finally stepped forward. His voice was firm but not unkind. "Emma, we'll talk about this after your shift. But for now, let me handle things." She barely managed a nod, her eyes darting around the room, unable to meet anyone's gaze. As she stepped back, hoping to disappear into the background, she could still feel the weight of their eyes on her, the judgment pressing in from all sides. Shaq, watching her retreat, turned to Mr. Thompson, his tone softening. "There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. Mistakes happen. What matters is how we move forward from them." His words weren't just for Emma. They were for everyone in the room. And as they settled into the space, something shifted. Some patrons lowered their heads, others nodded slowly, as if realizing their own silent complicity in what had just transpired. Then, as though signaling the end of the conversation, Shaq picked up his knife and fork and resumed his meal, his composure unshaken. But the moment would linger, a lesson carved into the air itself. Emma, standing at a distance, felt the finality of it all. She wasn't just another waitress making an error in judgment. This wasn't something she could simply brush off. This would be a defining moment, one that would alter how she viewed people, her job, and herself. Shaq finished his meal, dabbing his mouth with a napkin before slowly rising to his feet. The restaurant fell into an almost unnatural silence. Every eye, from the diners seated at their tables to the staff watching from the periphery, turned toward him. No one dared to move or speak. The quiet was thick, only broken by the occasional clinking of glasses or the distant murmur of conversation from another part of the building. His gaze swept the room, unreadable yet commanding. And then, with a voice that resonated through the very walls, he spoke. This restaurant was founded on the idea that everyone, no matter where they come from, no matter what they look like, deserves to be treated with dignity. That was the philosophy we built this place on. The weight of his words hung in the air, settling over the diners like an unspoken challenge. Unfortunately, tonight, we failed to uphold that belief. A ripple moved through the crowd, a collective awareness of the truth he had just spoken. Some lowered their heads, guilt settling into their expressions. Others nodded slightly, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Mr. Carter set down his wine glass, shaking his head. "He's right," he murmured. We all watched it happen, and none of us stepped in. Lisa leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Shaq. "He's not just talking about the staff. He's talking about all of us." Shaq let the silence stretch before he continued. "The world is full of prejudices. We judge based on appearances, on accents, on assumptions we make about people we don't even know. But I believe places like this should be different. La Lumiere should be a sanctuary where all are welcome, where no one is treated differently based on something as superficial as an outfit or a first impression." His gaze found Emma once more, not with condemnation, but with something almost like encouragement. "We all make mistakes. What defines us is what we learn from them." Emma swallowed hard. The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. There was no excuse she could offer, no justification that would erase what had happened. But perhaps, she realized, there was something she could do moving forward. Shaq turned back to the staff, his tone softer, but still firm. La Lumiere is not just a restaurant. It is a place where we build connections, not based on wealth or status, but on respect and kindness. If we lose sight of that, then we lose the very soul of what we have built here. The room remained still, the impact of his words settling in the hearts of everyone present. And then, with a final nod, Shaq turned and walked away, leaving behind a restaurant forever changed by his words. In the heart of the dense, uncharted wilderness, a lone wolf prowled the moonlit terrain. His name was Kiro, a formidable alpha whose silver-streaked fur gleamed under the pale glow of the night sky. Kiro was no ordinary wolf. He bore the wisdom of generations, passed down through the echoes of the wild. His amber eyes, deep and knowing, scanned the landscape as he moved silently, his powerful muscles rippling with every calculated step. For years, Kiro had ruled his pack with strength and strategy, leading them through harsh winters, famine, and rival threats. But tonight, an air of unease clung to him like a shadow. The forest was too quiet, the usual chorus of nocturnal life subdued. Kiro's instincts bristled, warning him of an unseen presence lurking beyond the trees. He paused, ears perked, listening intently. Then, a rustle, a movement too deliberate to be the wind. His lips curled back, revealing sharp fangs as a deep growl rumbled in his throat. The scent that reached him carried a foreign undertone, an anomaly amidst the familiar scents of pine and damp earth. From the darkness emerged a figure, a wolf unlike any Kiro had seen before. Towering and cloaked in shadows, its fur shimmered with an eerie blue luminescence. Eyes like molten silver locked onto Kiro's, radiating a silent challenge. Kiro's muscles tensed, instincts warring between fight and flight. But he was an alpha. Retreat was not an option. He met the intruder's gaze with unwavering dominance, stepping forward as his pack watched from a cautious distance. The two wolves circled each other, testing boundaries. The stranger's presence was unnatural, its aura tinged with something beyond the realm of ordinary beasts. A low, guttural voice echoed in Kiro's mind, though the stranger's mouth never moved. You stand at the threshold of a forgotten power, Kiro. The blood of the ancients flows within you. Do you seek the truth of your lineage? A flicker of recognition stirred within Kiro. Stories whispered by the elders spoke of celestial wolves, guardians of the wild, beings of immense power who once roamed freely before vanishing into legend. Was this creature one of them? His silence was answer enough. The stranger stepped closer, and the air between them shimmered. Kiro braced himself, expecting an attack, but instead, the wolf touched its forehead to his. A rush of visions flooded his mind, memories not his own, landscapes bathed in stardust, wolves walking among constellations, and a grand war that sealed their fate. Kiro staggered back, breathless. The celestial wolf watched, its expression unreadable. You are the last of our kin, it intoned. The balance of the wild depends on your awakening. Choose wisely, for your path will shape the fate of all who dwell under the moon. With that, the being stepped back, fading into the mist like a dream dissolving at dawn. The forest around Kiro seemed to breathe again, the tension lifting as nocturnal creatures resumed their symphony. Yet, something within Kiro had irrevocably changed. As the first rays of dawn kissed the treetops, Kiro turned to his pack, his eyes now glinting with newfound purpose. The burden of destiny lay heavy upon him, but he would carry it. For he was not just an alpha of the wild, he was a guardian of a legacy far greater than himself. And so, under the boundless sky, Kiro's journey truly began.